All right, welcome everyone to the Valkey fireside chat. Fiona, do you have the slides available for us to keep going? So today in today's webinar, our goal is to have an overview of what Valkey's roadmap for 2025. And our main goal is to highlight key differences from Redis and also show how Valkey offers a sustainable open source alternative. Before I present the amazing speakers we have today, I would like to go through some housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is for you, so feel free to ask any questions you might have. We will go through them after, so we save some time for that in the end. So don't be shy. Use the Q&A box. We'll be more than happy to help you. The more you ask, the more relevant this webinar it will be for you. Also, I really hope you can stick with us until the end, but if you can't, this will be recorded. This is being recorded. So yeah, super happy to send you the recording after the webinar. So without further ado, let me present the speakers for today. We have Kyle Davis. Kyle is a huge Valkey advocate, as you will see during the webinar. He's the founding contributor to the Open Search project. He's built community around Rocket OS. And because he doesn't have enough to do, he also wrote a book, blogs, tutorials, and he also likes to, 3D printing and gets his hands dirty in his garden as well. So not everything is just, coding. From our side, we have Bashir, our senior software engineer at UpCloud. He leads the integration of managed-based solutions. That's one of the reasons why he's here with us today. His areas of expertise are system provisioning, microservices architecture, managed servers, and he also deserves to rest a bit. And when he does, he likes football, chess, and obviously coding, because, it's not only work, but also a passion. After the fire chat with these great experts, we also have Janky from Ivan, and she'll be, helping with any questions that you have regarding Valkey and Ivan, and she'll be super happy to answer any questions in this regard. So with no further ado, with the actual fire, virtual but very cozy nevertheless, let's this amazing chart begin. So Bashir, I'll let you go from here.
Thank you, my father. Amazing intro. All right, so UpCloud has recently released Valkey as an alternative solution for Redis, and we would like to build more awareness about the product, what it means for our customers, and also what it means to the open source community. So in our chat today, I will be having a discussion with Kyle. Kyle, could you give us a short history of Valkey, the genesis of Valkey? I think that's what I have been asked many times now by many developers. It seems to be quite the hot topic, especially with all what happened. So please go ahead.
Sure thing. Yeah, so I can't really talk about the genesis of the project without mentioning Redis, right? So Redis has been around for many years, started by Salvatore Sanfilippo, just many years ago. And it kind of took the industry as effective way to really increase performance in applications. And it was used everywhere. Redis Labs came along after Redis was created, so they didn't create the project, and now they're called Redis Inc. And they worked with it, hired Salvatore, who was the creator of it, and Salvatore left in 2020. Actually worked at Redis for a while. I left in 2020. And they put it in charge of this kind of maintainer group that had people from Redis Labs or Redis Inc., however you want to call it, and other organizations as well. And so it worked as a community governance. Fast forward to March of this year, 2024, Redis, who had been BSD 3 licensed, open source project used everywhere, Redis Inc. said, we're going to change the license, and we're going to change it to a couple of different proprietary licenses, actually. And at that point, they dissolved the kind of community governance of the project. And those people who weren't working for Redis directly, they forked the project at version 7.2.4 and formed the Valkey project. Originally, it was actually called Placeholder KV, which I think was a kind of a clever name. It was that way for a couple weeks, and then Valkey was formed. Now, Valkey is a Linux Foundation project, so anything that occurred previously where it was controlled by a single company is now kind of impossible because it is neutrally governed by multiple organizations, and being housed at the Linux Foundation means that there's not a company behind it, right? Like there's no one company that controls it. So that's kind of where Valkey came from, and that happened. The license change was in March, and the project was launched in April. I mean, it was like just a few weeks of difference. So that's where the project came from, and it's been a really exciting time since April of 2024 as the project's developed. I mean, it's only been a few months, and just tremendous things have happened in that amount of time.
Good to hear. You mentioned now that the Redis itself was governed by multiple organizations. So was there like a majority? Was the core Redis lab the majority? Is that how they managed to actually change the license, or what exactly here?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. Like that wasn't done in a controlled way. They just kind of did it, and because of that, there was a lot of contributors. Like it wasn't just the people who were already in the governing body. They took existing contributors to the Redis project that had a background of good contributions to Redis itself, and then they became the leadership of Valkey, right? So if you want to think about it, it's like there was a representation from about 3 organizations, and 2 of those organizations, the non-Redis organizations, went and started forming Valkey alongside those other contributors. So it was done kind of unilaterally, and that's one of the dangers of kind of these single vendor projects that aren't neutrally governed, right? When you have neutral governance, it makes this impossible to accomplish it any other way. So it really gives you a level of protection that you don't have when you just have a company behind it. It worked on good faith and vibes up to 2024, and then those went away.
Yes, I have seen many negative feedback about that, especially about the community feeling betrayed with this bait and switch approach that it happened. So we can reassure our customers, we can reassure the open community that the Linux Foundation will not change any license. Can you state that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't say that the license wouldn't change. I don't know what the future will hold as far as that's concerned, but it will be open source. I can say that. There's no plans, and to be clear, it's protected from the exact thing that happened at Redis, right? In the future there might be some weird series of events that could change something, but it wouldn't happen the same way, and it will be open source. I can say that. But like I said, I think it's going to be BSD 3 clause for its entire existence unless something extraordinary happens. And then it would still be some sort of other open source license.
Even if something happens, there is also always the possibility to fork again. So
yeah, that's true. But it's not going to be necessary. It's always going to be neutrally governed. That's the most important thing. And like I said, the chances of something happening and it changing away from BSD license just seems extraordinary and just not really going to happen. But I don't want to be one of those people that can go in and say, I can predict the future, because I can't.
All right. So when we say Valkey compared to Redis, are they, when we talk about version 7 to X, are we saying a different product at this point, same product or not? We are right now actually offering version 7.6, and we are now aiming to transition our customers from Redis to Valkey. So what does that mean for them?
And you said 7.2.6 is what you're saying, right?
Yes, vendor patch. Yeah.
So there's 2 things to look at here. Redis and Valkey are no longer the same thing, right? You have to think of them as 2 separate projects. But from the perspective of software, 7.2.x is functionally a name change. There is no appreciable feature differences. There's no appreciable code changes. What has happened for that release from Redis 7.2x to Valkey 7.2x was effectively a name change, right? Search, find Redis, replaced with Valkey. And that's done for like trademark and legal reasons, right? That was the initial reason that it happened. There were some very, very minor changes that were already slated to be incorporated into Redis before the fork happened. But those were incorporated in Valkey 7.2x as well. But you're going to be hard pressed to find any of those changes or feel any of those changes. I think they're more of housekeeping than anything. So the projects are separate, right? And you can think of them as like the literal fork in the road. But at that point, there's been no divergence in the 7.2x pathway. Now, from the perspective of the future, Redis is doing their own thing. Valkey is doing their own thing, right? Like we've now started looking at two different paths, but the command set and the things that are exposed to you are going to be pretty familiar. If you're using something existing based on Redis, you can switch without making changes. And in fact, they can even talk to each other and all sorts of other things, which I'm sure we'll cover later. But
yes,
yeah. So that's the lay of the land, right? Think of them separately, but being the same in all but name.
All right. So for Q1, we are planning to have version 8 in the pipeline. What are the changes that we should expect? Or it's already released, so please go ahead and maybe highlight some features.
Yeah, so version 8 is really exciting. So 7.2x was exciting, certainly. But that was something where you could be excited about the project. 8.0 is where you get excited about the technology. There was two kind of big differences that came into 8.0. And there's other things too. But the two biggest things that happened, one is a completely rewrite of the multi-threading architecture. Now, Redis, for the most part, had this idea of being single-threaded. As it started, early on, it was single-threaded entirely. And then around version 4, they started to do some small things in multiple threads. And it kind of progressively went, and they did some incremental changes. But it still remained largely single-threaded. And the data, that one thing I do want to separate out here when we talk about 8 is that data access, and this is the most important thing for your guarantees on your data, has always been single-threaded, and it will probably remain single-threaded with few exceptions. But 8.0 completely rewrote and radically changed the threading architecture versus Redis, and that brought with it performance. When you look at what Redis was developed for, it was developed, like in the late 2000s, and CPUs at that time were pretty simple. Fewer cores available, the smaller caches, all sorts of things like that. Today in 2024, we have radically different silicon that's underlying all this. Way more cores, way more cache, and effectively what's happened is we rewrote the architecture, especially for I/O, to take advantage of more of the silicon. So when you look at that, the multi-threading comes in, a completely multi-threaded I/O. So Valkey spent Redis spent a lot of time in Valkey 7.2x actually, putting things out to the user, and it was spending most of that time not really being effective. Valkey 8 can take that and take advantage of more of the silicon available in your infrastructure and squeeze more performance out of the same amount of infrastructure by taking advantage of multiple threads for your I/O. Super exciting, but it doesn't change any of the data guarantees, right? So you basically get this kind of free performance. It is very sophisticated compared to where we were in 7.2x in earlier versions of Redis. Now, the other thing that changed in 8.0 is how the dictionary works. Now, when you look at Valkey, effectively it has all the keys, and that's how you access data in Valkey. It's a key value database. you have to access those keys and reference those keys. So that's one of the main places where a lot of memory is taken up. So 8.0 started down the line of rewriting that main dictionary and getting more effective packing of all the different entries in that dictionary, which means that you can save, we were saving, small amounts of bytes on every key, but that adds up as you scale. Most people have a small amount or a large amount of keys that have small amounts of data in them. And so again, what you're doing is taking the same amount of infrastructure, the same amount of memory, and squeezing more data into it. And that's what people care about. People want it to be faster and they want it to store more. And so 8.0 delivered on those two areas.
Coming back at the multi-threading, to be clear, here there is no breaking change. So this is a complete write internally.
That's
correct.
Right. That's correct. Well, and I want to just index on that one piece because 8.0 did bring quote unquote breaking changes. But from the command set perspective, there's no API changes. Your existing applications will work. The reason it's kind of considered a breaking change is you may be way over provisioned because of the multi-threading. So if you were using, let's say, I'm just making a number up, 100 shards to achieve the performance envelope that you want to get, you now don't need that many. So that's effectively a breaking change from an infrastructure and provisioning standpoint. But from a command set standpoint, no breaking changes. Your applications will not even notice the difference.
And what about the ordering of the commands? Now, are we talking only just multi-threading or parallel requests or anything? I think this has always brings up whenever I hear multi-threading, parallel requests.
And this is something that a lot of people worry about because there has been some databases that have fallen flat when they have gone to a multi-threaded architecture, but you don't have to worry about that in this case because the data access loop, which is extremely fast, we're talking about low milliseconds to actually access the data, remains single-threaded for each node in your cluster. That guarantee stay the same. The ordering won't change, but what's really changing is we can now quickly send that out to another thread and not have to wait to go to the next part. So it's single-threaded it's a single-threaded event loop for the data access, but the multi-threading is all on separate cores. So your ordering guarantees are the same. All that's the same. There's not anything to worry about as far as your application is concerned.
So basically, it's a more efficient way of offloading commands.
That's right.
Okay. Final question about multi-threading. What about the linear reference for how many threads do you have? Is there a limit? Have you done some benchmark, seen where we hit the actual thread level, or?
There is actually some really good data on that. If you go to Valkey.io, which is the website for the project, there is a very extensive blog that kind of goes over how you would allocate things for this. And frankly, running Valkey multi-threaded at this point is something that I wouldn't call non-trivial. There is some effort that you have to do to tune it to be correct. Now, for the people like on your service, that's taken care of for you, so you don't have to worry about this. But if you're running it on your own architecture, you do have to look at this. And what we found is that there are limits that it doesn't linearly go forever for the multi-threading. Now, where you can start expanding out from there that's when you start adding nodes to your cluster, right? So we talk about multi-threading on an individual node by node basis or for single instances. So yes, you do kind of reach a plateau for the threads that you can use effectively, and then you also have to have there's other cases where we'll use another thread for doing some other replication and things like that kind of are separate from all this that you would have to kind of allocate for. So you don't want to go overboard on it. Certainly you have to match your infrastructure to that. There's also a blog post where somebody tried to saturate a Raspberry Pi. How fast can you make a Raspberry Pi go with Valkey 8? And in that case, that is a more limited, more like something that we had when Redis first came out in the late 2000s. So in that model, you don't get as much advantage from it because it's a much simpler CPU. But server class stuff, you get a lot of advantage out of it.
Glad to hear. I will be doing some testing, that's for sure. Anything else we expect in version 8? I saw some highlight about new native support for JSON and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that
So
also included in that version, or was it on the next one?
yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. So Valkey aims to do 2 releases per year. So in the first part of the calendar year, there is going to be a patch release, and then in the latter part of the calendar year, second half, there'll be a major version. So right now we released 8.0 in September, late September, and that goes over the multi-threading. It goes over the revised dictionary. Now 8.0, which will come out in the open source version, I'm not sure of your timeline for supporting 8.1, that will include more things as far as modules for like native JSON support, native Bloom filter support, and vector similarity search. And these are implemented as modules. We say native, but they're implemented as modules, but they natively extend Valkey, which means that they operate like any other command in the command set, but they are something that can be enabled or disabled. But those are huge things that people ask for all the time. I mean, what day do you go through of a developer not touch JSON, right? Like I'd be really challenged to find anybody
Yes, indeed.
who doesn't look at a JSON in a single day.
Final question about version. Anything about the V2 clustering that I have heard about, the centralized state? Is that also 8.1, or is it future upcoming? Has there been any progress on that?
So that's something that there's a lot of rumblings about, and if you pay attention to the GitHub repo, you'll start seeing some people talk about that. That's going to be something we're targeting for 9. That is a major change from the architecture of the software. So the clustering implementation has been around for many years. I don't quote me on this, but I believe it was around version 3 of Redis when that came out. So we're talking about a decade in. Or so, and now like I said, infrastructure has changed in the time. We've found some good examples in other software that the state can be managed in different ways. So there's lots of active work on that, but that's targeted for 9. So second half of 2025 for that, and I think that's really exciting. And I think it's made a big change for people. But one of the things that's really interesting about Valkey is that I don't anticipate this is going to have a lot of impact on your existing software. All these changes are being done, so the API that you've written against, that you may have something from 6-7 years ago that you wrote and you perfected and you don't want to touch, that's okay. The technical steering committee of Valkey, which has people from various different organizations, have pretty well stated that there's not any desire to make breaking changes to that layer. The guarantees will stay the same. The command set will only get added to and changed in a backwards compatible way. So you can basically, the code you write today is not going to break for version 9, even the clustering changes. And I think that's really important. We have, as an example, people in the telecom industry on our technical steering committee, and they have Valkey running on infrastructure out in the field. It's very difficult to change. So as you can imagine, that's something that's very important to them. But it's nice because everybody benefits from this sort of thing. Like, who doesn't like taking software that you've written and invested time into, and being able to run it for the order of years, right? Like, that's the dream in most software.
When we talk about Valkey since its launch, you have been part of Valkey since day 1. How do you think the progress has been? How did you feel initially when you started the project, and how you're feeling now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of apprehension that people had about the project. Is it going to make big changes? Is it going to break my stuff? Is it going to lag behind? These are the apprehensions that people have, and every every place that we've gone with it, we've not seen that happen. There's been just an outpouring of support for the project, both from people just kind of saying to us at conferences, like, this is important for the industry, but also when bugs come up. I was just having a conversation with the technical steering committee last night about, like, do we have enough issues in our repo tagged, help wanted, and the value in that was kind of diminished because a bug will pop up, let's say in the afternoon in US Pacific time. Someone in Asia will pick it up. It will be gone back and forth in Europe. And then by the time that Pacific morning rolls around, it's already merged, right? So this velocity has only increased and stayed this way. So I think what we're going to see from that perspective, as the project continues to move forward, a constant stream of development that creates a solid piece of software that progresses at a really quick rate. And from that perspective, I think that we're going to see a lot of excitement, especially as we start implementing bigger features. And I think, as we talk about 8.0 and 8.1 and 9.0, that velocity of features will go up. So that's what makes me really excited about the project, is that there's a lot of smart people working on this at various different companies. Okay. We have, our TSC has people from Google, from AWS, from Tencent, Alibaba, Ericsson, Huawei. These are big companies that have big vested interest in making Valkey really successful. And it's not just, one company or one person's perspective. It's coming from all over, and the contributors from other organizations as well. So it's really exciting to see this come out.
So leading to the topic of the contributors, if we have developers that want to contribute to Valkey, how will they be able to do that? Is there some requirements or not?
It depends on what you want to do. So Valkey is open to contribution. That's what I will say. So our GitHub repo is valkey-io/Valkey on GitHub. Pretty easy to find. We're often one of the trending projects on GitHub, depending on the velocity of work and what part of the cycle we're in. So certainly we're into that. Now, the TSC is quite protective of, like, the API, and then that's their job, right? From a couple perspectives. One, they don't want to make the API change. So, I have had PRs where people have said, like, well, that's a great idea, but how do we implement this in a way that doesn't break anybody? So that's one thing. So then the other thing is they don't want to over expand themselves as far as the API is concerned. So there's two ways that you can do this. One, existing improvements to existing commands or implementations of those commands that make them faster. Certainly open to contribution. There's no requirement you can walk in. We've had people who have been what we call drive-by contributors that we don't know who they are. They come in, they drop a lot of great code, and they move on with their life. That's certainly something we love and we see. And then we have people that kind of make it part of their workflow and their jobs, and they're contributing consistently and being part of the conversations every day. And then, of course, Valkey can be extended through a module system, and there's lots of work going on from that as well. And that's something you don't have to have permission. You can create a module today and then run it on Valkey. And so that's something that as well. Like, for example, I did talk about JSON and Bloom and vector search. Those are implemented as modules. So there's a bigger capacity there for making changes to the API, but the core API is something we're very protective of.
Yeah. I've seen many direct fork of Redis previously, so that's why I was asking about the contribution, because I wanted to understand, like, did they not agree with the direction of Valkey? Was there like some strict requirement, or did they just want different product from Redis? We have seen, for example, KeyDB, DragonflyDB, and so on, Redis as well. And any idea why they actually forked? Was it because of that, or was it for different reasons? Monetization, for example, is one of them.
Well, Dragonfly isn't a fork. Dragonfly is an API compatible version. Or compatible to some degree. So that's not a fork, but we did see KeyDB, and KeyDB actually forked prior to the license change, and I think they forked several years ago. And some of this came down to, the original model for Redis was, a benevolent dictator for life, right? That was what Salvatore was, and then he retired from the project in 2020. Then went to community governance. So some of the things were, maybe they went a different technical direction, right? And that's what you saw with KeyDB. And then you see some other projects. Redict is one that when the license change happened, they went with a different license, right? So they went with a LGPL license, and that's fine. And then they're maintaining kind of the stable version at a lower version in an LGPL license, and more power to them for that. So some of it's technical direction, some of it's the open source differences, and we see there's actually very few Redis forks out there that have been successful over the long term, but because Valkey has such a history of its contributors have such a history with Redis, and it's now a Linux Foundation project. It's got legs, we think, and certainly you see companies putting their weight behind it and switching over entirely because the licenses
or switching back.
yeah. The licenses are just for Redis are not something that most people want to deal with, right? That's just it. They're not those that are friendly to most people's policies and their legal frameworks for operating.
Yep. I have maybe a few more questions, and then we can maybe continue with Mafalda. Kyle, can you tell us any more? What is the future of Valkey? What are the features that we are working on? You mentioned earlier vector search. Is this something on work right now, or is this a decision? What about integration with OpenTelemetry and so on? Also seeing some discussion about that.
Yeah, so I think that the future is interesting because what we're seeing is, and some of this stuff it has fascinating history, right? Like because there were some often implemented or often requested features like JSON, there's multiple different implementations for different suppliers of it. So what Valkey has done, because a lot of those now suppliers or providers of Valkey, there's multiple implementations, and we've been able to choose the best one, right? Best as far as evaluation from a variety of circumstances. So, vector search, that's a collaboration, and I think you're going to see more and more collaborations on these pieces, right? So these aren't necessarily net new, but maybe there's something that we're kind of behind, a wall and only available for a single provider's customers are now being open sourced, right? And we'll see that with Valkey JSON and Valkey vector search. Super exciting on those fronts. I think there has been a ongoing and concerted effort to increase observability. I'm not entirely sure where that's going to lead. There's some kind of competing implementations and thoughts around what needs to be, using standards that are outward facing, so like OTel, and then some kind of unique and homegrown solutions that are unique for the velocity at which data works in Valkey. So those are yet to be determined. But one thing that I didn't mention in 8.0 was this per slot metrics. I don't want to get too deep in the technical details, but each node or each cluster rather separates out the entire key space into 16,000 and change slots and hash slots effectively that clusters take. So if you have let's say you have 16 clusters, they'll take around 1,000 hash slots each. And in the past, we've had kind of this black box of observability. Now there's per slot metrics on that, so you can really control and see how your entire cluster is being allocated. Do you have hot slots that are, for whatever data reasons, are being over allocated? Can you scale up that individual node that contains that slot to allocate for it? So we're seeing more and more precision in that. I think that's a really good advantage. That's kind of hard to transform into OTel.
Yes.
So, like I said, it's competing. There's some really interesting things. We do have an RFC process for big major changes, and there's an RFC in progress right now for some of the observability features that will land probably 8.1 or 9. But it's really interesting to see how people are thinking about it, and some of these cause very deep discussions on the technical steering committee's agenda.
Kyle, I would say the future look promising for Valkey. Thank you so much for answering my questions. And Mafalda, I think I will get back to you now.
Yeah, great chat. Thank you so much. I feel that all the questions that were asked in the chat were kind of answered throughout the conversation, but to make sure they don't remain unanswered, I will start with this one from Chris. With Valkey being forked from Redis and having an open source license, does it at this stage have different features than Redis? Or at this stage will still very similar in functionality to Redis? Or is there any other plan?
Yeah, I can take that. It's interesting because right now, when you look at the feature sets, they're very similar. I think Redis has released a 7.4.x, so that was after the fork, and there's been some minor changes. One of the things that they implemented is something that we also have on our roadmap, which is hash field exploration. So effectively in that is, the hash data type has subfields. They're kind of like a mini version of the main dictionary in use case. And that's something they implemented, but we operate on kind of a clean room way of developing. So we're not going to look at the source code because it's not open source, but we're implementing a similar implementation or similar use to that for the end user. It's probably going to be implemented in different ways. And I think that's what you'll see. One thing that is interesting, though, when you take a look at the contribution stream that Redis gets, you'll often see Valkey contributors in theirs because we're open source and they're legally allowed to take our contributions. So I think what you're going to see eventually as time moves on, and there'll be a point where they'll be so diverged that I think you won't see this, but in the kind of near future, I think it's, and if I was at Redis, I'd do the same thing. I would pick up the really cool stuff from Valkey. So in that way, you start seeing it being kind of pseudo upstream, which is really exciting and interesting from how you're thinking about these projects, right? So you very well might see some very interesting feature in Valkey being picked up by Redis, but we're not going to do the other way around because license differences and we don't even need to though.
I see that Jenke is writing the answer to one of the questions. So I'll leave it there, answered in a written form. So I would go to the second question, which is, again, I think we touched upon this, but just as a short summary to end, what are the main advantages of Valkey over Redis?
Yeah, I think the main advantage, it depends on the version you're on, right? But what I would say about this is that Valkey has a very bright future. When you start changing over to Valkey, you're going to have an open source roadmap of features that you'll get consistently. There's not one company that has any desire to keep it behind a paywall. So that's going to be a huge advantage that you're going to have. Now, as we move into the future, as we move into 8.0, which is the current, or it's going to be something that you're going to have in next year, and into the future, you're going to see performance benefits from Valkey. Now, Redis is going to do their own thing, and they may have something that comes out as well. Benchmarks are always hard to compare across products, but I think that advantage, there's just a whole lot of resources being put into the performance and the memory efficiency. In the near term, I think memory efficiency is one thing that is going to continually get tighter and tighter. And so you're going to be able just to do more with the infrastructure that you already have.
Fantastic. I think it's a great way to actually end our fireside chat. Thank you so much, everyone, Kyle, Bashir, Janki, for being here today with us and for answering all the questions. For the audience, if you have remaining questions, feel free to connect with them on LinkedIn or to also get in touch with us at UpCloud. We will have more webinars coming up next year, so feel free to continue following our, what's going on in our company as well. And we will have also a blog post in a couple of days that summarizes the amazing chat we had here. So yeah, thank you everyone who came, who interacted, and obviously to the great speakers for sharing the knowledge. So thank you so much, everyone.